Before we dive into this wild ride, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Whether it's a quiet cul-de-sac in Arizona, a busy apartment block in New York, or a peaceful lakeside cabin up in Minnesota. I love hearing just how far these current tales of chaos and karma can travel. Gravel crunched under heavy tires, the sound echoing through the quiet countryside like the start of a storm. The silver SUV came to a sudden halt at the edge of the farm's driveway, dust lifting in angry clouds. Its driver door flung open, and out stepped Nancy, short-haired and red-faced. Her floral blouse stretched tight across her frame as if straining to contain her fury. Rachel followed seconds later, her twin in both size and temperament, equally dressed in gaudy colors that clashed against the green of the fields. Together, they were a wall of noise, shouting and gesturing at the wooden gate that marked the ranch entrance. Behind that gate stood Daniel, 38 years old, hat tilted low against the afternoon sun, denim jeans streaked with dirt from morning chores. He wasn't a man of many words, but he didn't need to be. The way he leaned against the post, calm, almost casual, only deepened their rage. He could see the silver SUV idling, its engine still rattling like an impatient beast waiting for release. He could also see what they wanted. They didn't care about the farm. They didn't care about rules. They wanted convenience, and his gate stood in their way. "Move it," Nancy barked, her voice sharp enough to slice the summer air. "This ridiculous farm gate is blocking the neighborhood's access. We told you it needs to come down." Now, Daniel let the silence linger. The sisters hated silence. They needed conflict to survive, feeding off it like fire on dry brush. He finally spoke, low and steady, his tone cutting through their noise with calm precision. "This is private property. My property. The gate stays." Rachel rolled her eyes, so hard it seemed rehearsed. "You think you're special because you've got a few cows and some dirt? This is an HOA community, cowboy. You follow the rules, or we make sure you regret it." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't give them the reaction they wanted. He'd seen their kind before in boardrooms, in bars, in backyards. People who confused arrogance with power, who mistook intimidation for control. But what made Nancy and Rachel dangerous wasn't just their entitlement. It was their persistence. They didn't stop when told no. They doubled down, coming back louder, meaner, more reckless every time. He remembered the first encounter vividly. It had been a Saturday morning, dew still clinging to the grass, when he'd found their SUV parked sideways across his driveway. No note, no reason, just there, blocking the path like a deliberate dare. He'd knocked politely on their door, asked them to move it. Instead of an apology, he'd received laughter. They'd told him the driveway was wide enough that he could just go around. He didn't argue, not then. He simply waited until they moved it, his patience misread as weakness. But patience has limits, and the sisters had been testing his daily. From parking inches away from his fence line to hollering insults when he worked outside, they treated his farm as their playground, their battleground. The HOA board, stacked with their friends, turned a blind eye. Complaints went nowhere. Rules bent in their favor. Every time Daniel looked out across his land, his sanctuary, he saw their SUV circling like a predator that had scented blood. Now, standing across from them, he could see the escalation in their eyes. Nancy jabbed a finger toward the gate, her voice rising. "This eyesore ruins the neighborhood. We'll keep coming until you learn to cooperate. You think you can outlast us? Watch what happens." Rachel smirked, folding her arms across her chest, her gaze locking onto Daniel's calm stance, as if daring him to blink. "You'll cave. They always do." He didn't blink. Instead, he glanced at the SUV. The way it sat there, gleaming in the sun, hood reflecting light like a polished blade. He knew it was their prized possession. They drove it like it was armor, like it gave them the right to plow through anything in their way. And in that moment, Daniel understood something vital. They wouldn't be satisfied with words. They wanted dominance. And they'd use that SUV to try to get it. A low breeze carried the scent of hay from the barn behind him, a reminder of why he'd fought so hard to hold onto this land. This was more than just dirt and fences. It was his father's work, his family's heritage, and his own hard-earned freedom. He wasn't about to surrender it to two loud women with too much time and too little respect. Nancy stepped closer to the gate, close enough that Daniel could see the sweat glistening on her forehead. "We'll give you until tomorrow. Take this thing down, or we'll handle it ourselves." Daniel met her glare, then looked past her at Rachel, who stood with her arms crossed like an executioner waiting for the signal. His silence, again, infuriated them. Without another word, they spun back toward their SUV, slamming doors so hard the echo carried across the field. Gravel spat up as the vehicle lurched forward, pulling away in a cloud of dust. Daniel didn't move until the sound of the engine faded into the distance. That night, long after the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel sat on his porch, staring at the gate. The crickets sang their endless chorus, and the stars blinked against the dark sky, but his mind wasn't on the beauty of the night. It was on the storm brewing. He knew they'd be back. He could feel it. People like Nancy and Rachel didn't deliver warnings. They delivered promises. And their promise was clear. They would try to destroy what was his. The following morning confirmed it. He woke to find fresh tire tracks cutting across the edge of his field, deep grooves carved into the soil. They hadn't been subtle. They'd driven in circles near his fence line, leaving scars across his land like signatures of defiance. On the fence itself, a small section of wood had been snapped, splintered by a deliberate push. Not enough to collapse it, just enough to send a message. Daniel crouched, running his hand along the break. His stomach tightened, not with fear, but with resolve. They were escalating. And once people like that start, they rarely stop on their own. His gate was their next target. They'd set out right. He straightened, the morning sun casting long shadows across the field, and stared at the wooden frame. To them, it was just an obstacle. To him, it was a line in the sand. And they were about to cross it. Later that afternoon, he saw them again. The SUV rolled past slowly, both sisters inside, windows down. Rachel shouted something unintelligible, laughter spilling out behind it, while Nancy leaned out the passenger side with a mocking wave. The SUV didn't stop, just prowled past like a wolf circling prey. Daniel watched from the porch, arms crossed, eyes cold. They thought he was unprepared. They thought he'd give in. They thought wrong. By evening, he was still outside, waiting, when the sound of the SUV returned, its engine louder this time, revving with purpose. The headlights cut across the fading light as the vehicle rolled up to the gate once more. Nancy stepped out first, hands on hips, her expression a mix of triumph and menace. Rachel joined her, arms folded, eyes locked on Daniel. The gate stood between them, tall, weathered, and strong, but he knew what they saw. They saw something they could break. Nancy's voice rang out, sharp and final. "Last chance, cowboy. Tomorrow this gate comes down, whether you like it or not." Daniel's grip tightened on the railing of his porch. The air between them felt heavy, charged, as though the land itself was holding its breath. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence told them everything. They smirked, turned back toward their SUV, and drove off into the night. The crickets picked up their song again, but Daniel barely heard them. His eyes stayed on the gate, his mind already turning, already planning. They had just declared war, and wars are never won by standing still. The following days blurred into a rhythm of tension. Daniel worked his land as he always had, feeding the cattle, repairing fence lines, checking irrigation. But every task carried the shadow of anticipation. He knew they were circling, waiting for the moment to strike. His instincts told him it wouldn't be long. When people like Nancy and Rachel delivered threats, they weren't idle words. They were blueprints. The first escalation came small, but sharp enough to draw blood. On a Sunday morning, as Daniel walked to his truck to haul feed, he noticed a deep scratch carved into the driver's side door. Long, deliberate, and unmistakable, the gouge ran across the paint like a scar. His stomach knotted. It hadn't been there yesterday. He didn't need witnesses to know who had done it. Their laughter the night before, drifting from the SUV as they circled past his property, suddenly made sense. It was a test, another move in their campaign of harassment. He filed a report with the sheriff, but the deputy who showed up just sighed, notebook in hand, eyes already tired. "Got no cameras? No eyewitnesses?" the man asked, his tone flat. Daniel shook his head. The deputy clicked his pen shut. "Then there's nothing we can prove. Sorry." The words sounded rehearsed, the kind of apology that meant nothing. When the deputy drove off, Daniel was left standing in the driveway, staring at the fresh scar on his truck. His reflection wavered in the dented metal, his own face tight with quiet rage. He wasn't a man who lost control easily, but there was something about deliberate cruelty that cut deeper than physical damage. He'd worked years to build this life, to make this farm his refuge. And now 2 women with a silver SUV thought they could stomp all over it because no one told them no. The second escalation came louder. One evening, as twilight set the sky ablaze with streaks of orange and red, Daniel heard shouting from the road. He stepped outside to see the sisters again, their SUV parked at an angle, blocking half the lane. Rachel leaned out of the driver's side, voice dripping with mockery. "Nice gate you got there. Be a shame if something happened to it." Nancy laughed so loud it echoed against the barn walls. They didn't approach this time. They didn't need to. The threat was clear. Daniel tried every peaceful avenue he could stomach. He went to the next HOA meeting, sitting stiff-backed in a plastic chair under the fluorescent lights of the community hall. He spoke clearly, calmly, laying out the harassment, the vandalism, the threats. The board members exchanged glances, some nodding faintly, but when Nancy and Rachel stormed in halfway through, the tide shifted. "They're lying," Nancy said before he even finished. She raised her voice over his, accusing him of being hostile, unsafe, a menace to the neighborhood. Rachel chimed in, feigning outrage, acting the victim with a performance so dramatic it could have won an award. The board, filled with their allies, murmured in agreement. By the time the meeting ended, Daniel wasn't the one protected. He was the one painted as the problem. Walking back to his truck afterward, he clenched his fists, the veins in his arms tight. They were winning, at least on paper. But the truth of people like them is that their arrogance blinds them. They believed they'd crushed his spirit. What they didn't know was that every insult, every scratch, every mocking laugh was fuel. He was past the point of retreat. He was thinking ahead, calculating, preparing. The final straw came without warning. Late one night, Daniel was jolted awake by the crunch of wood and the low growl of an engine outside. He grabbed his flashlight and sprinted to the porch. The beam cut across the driveway just in time to catch the SUV pulling back from a gate. The wood sagged slightly. One side pushed inward, splinters hanging like broken teeth. They hadn't gone full force, just a shove, a taste of what was coming. Enough to rattle, not enough to destroy. The SUV lingered for a moment, headlights glaring like eyes in the dark, before peeling away into the night. Daniel stood in the yard, heart pounding, the cool air stinging his lungs. His gait, his line in the sand, had just been nudged. They were testing it. And the next time, they wouldn't hold back. Sleep didn't come after that. He sat at the kitchen table, coffee untouched, staring at blueprints that didn't exist on paper but lived sharp in his mind. Reinforcement. That was the answer. They wanted to hit him where it hurt. Fine. He'd turned the very thing they targeted into a weapon of its own. The next morning, he called a friend, an old welding buddy who'd helped him patch farm equipment over the years. Together, they hauled heavy steel beams from the shop, the kind used to support barns and machinery, and brought them to the gate. They worked under the hot sun, sparks flying as metal met metal, the smell of burnt steel filling the air. The wooden frame remained, weathered and familiar, but behind it, hidden, they forged a skeleton of iron. By the time they finished, the gate looked no different from before. Rustic, unassuming, the same barrier the sisters had mocked a dozen times. But beneath the surface, it was unyielding, a fortress disguised as a door. Daniel ran his hand over the finished work, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. He hadn't just repaired the gate. He'd transformed it. Now it wasn't just a line in the sand. It was a wall. That evening, As the sun dipped low and the fields glowed gold, Daniel sat on his porch again, eyes fixed on the road. The SUV rolled past slowly, as it often did, the sisters inside. Rachel at the wheel, Nancy craning her neck to sneer. They thought they saw the same old wooden gate. They thought nothing had changed. But Daniel knew better. His farm wasn't defenseless anymore. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to fight them on their terms. He'd let their arrogance drive them straight into their own downfall. The sisters revved their engine, a childish display meant to rattle him. Daniel didn't move. He watched them vanish down the road, his gaze steady, his breath calm. The trap was set, and he knew, with the certainty of a farmer reading the weather, that the storm was about to break. The morning was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses on the chest and warns of something about to happen. Daniel rose early, boots thudding against the wooden porch as he surveyed the land. The field swayed gently in the breeze, cattle moved lazily near the fence line, and the sun painted the sky with pale streaks of orange. Yet his focus never left the road. He knew they were coming. He could feel it in the air, a heavy charge like the pause before lightning strikes. It wasn't long before the distant growl of an engine broke the stillness. Dust kicked up on the horizon, rising in a thin, angry plume. The silver SUV appeared, larger than life in the morning haze, barreling down the gravel road with reckless speed. Behind the wheel was Rachel, her short hair plastered to her forehead, face twisted in determination. Beside her, Nancy gestured wildly, shouting through the windshield though he couldn't hear her words. Their floral blouses were loud even at a distance, clashing against the muted tones of the land. They looked less like neighbors and more like marauders charging a fortress. Daniel didn't flinch. He remained by the gate, one hand resting on the post, hat tipped low, as calm as if he were greeting the mailman. Inside, his heart hammered steady and hard, but it wasn't fear that drove it. It was readiness. Months of patience, weeks of planning, hours of sweat poured into steel. Everything had led to this moment. The SUV roared closer, engine straining, gravel flying from tires. Rachel didn't slow. If anything, she pressed harder on the accelerator, the vehicle hurtling forward like a weapon. Nancy's voice rose in a triumphant howl, her arms flailing as though she were rallying troops. To them, this was victory, the final act in their campaign of intimidation. They would smash his gate, humiliate him, prove to everyone in the neighborhood that resistance against them was futile. Then came the impact. The sound tore through the morning like a thunderclap. Metal screamed, glass shattered, and the hood of the SUV crumpled inward as if struck by an invisible hammer. The reinforced gate didn't so much as shudder. It stood solid, unmoved, its steel skeleton holding firm beneath the wooden disguise. The force of the collision sent the sisters lurching forward, airbags exploding from the dashboard with a violent hiss. White fabric filled the cabin, muffling their screams as the vehicle rocked backward, stunned by its own arrogance. Daniel didn't move. Dust hung in the air, the acrid stench of burnt rubber and leaking coolant drifting on the breeze. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood, rising like smoke from a defeated beast. The windshield was fractured, a spiderweb of broken glass catching the sunlight in jagged patterns. The sisters sat trapped, dazed and furious, their triumphant charge reduced to wreckage. Nancy shoved at the deflated airbag, her face red with a mix of shock and rage. She pushed the door open and stumbled out, nearly tripping on the uneven gravel. "You," she shrieked, pointing at Daniel with a trembling hand. "You did this. You set us up." Rachel emerged next, clutching her arm, her expression twisted in disbelief. The SUV hissed and sputtered behind them, fluids leaking onto the ground, a once prized possession reduced to a cautionary tale. She turned her glare on Daniel, her voice cracking. "You'll pay for this. You'll regret this." Daniel said nothing. His silence carried more weight than any words could. He stood tall, composed, the gate behind him pristine and unbroken. Neighbors began to appear, drawn by the crash. Doors opened, footsteps hurried, and soon a small crowd gathered along the road. Phones lifted into the air, recording every detail. The humiliation was no longer private. It was public, undeniable, eternal. Nancy noticed the cameras and screamed louder, her words tumbling over each other in desperation. He's dangerous. He built a death trap. He could have killed us. She stomped her foot like a child denied a toy, her blouse clinging with sweat. But the crowd wasn't buying it. They saw the truth in plain sight, an untouched gate, a ruined SUV, and two women who had brought destruction upon themselves. Rachel tried a different tactic, clutching her side as though wounded, her voice faltering into sobs. He's been threatening us. He set this up to hurt us. Someone call the police. The police didn't need calling. The crash had been loud enough to draw attention, far beyond the neighborhood. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder until two sheriff's cruisers rolled onto the scene. Deputies stepped out, hands resting on their belts, eyes scanning the wreck. They didn't need long to piece together what had happened. Daniel gave his account calmly, plainly, without embellishment. He described the threats, the vandalism, the late-night shove against his gate, and their promise to take it down themselves. He gestured to the SUV, its front end mangled beyond repair, and then to the gate, still standing strong. His tone was steady, not boastful, as though recounting simple facts. Nancy tried to shout him down, spitting accusations, but the deputies silenced her with raised hands. Rachel waved her arms wildly, demanding they arrest him, but the evidence was overwhelming. The deputies examined the scene, noted the tire marks leading directly into the gate, the lack of damage to the property, the obvious intent behind the crash. When one of them asked Daniel why the gate hadn't broken, he answered with a shrug. Reinforced it. It's my land. Needed it strong to keep the cattle safe. That simple explanation sealed it. The deputies turned to the sisters, their expressions firm. Charges were listed quickly. Reckless driving, destruction of property, trespassing, endangerment. Nancy's face drained of color, her bravado collapsing under the weight of reality. Rachel cursed under her breath, fists clenched, but there was no escape. Their arrogance had driven them straight into their own downfall. As the tow truck arrived to haul away the crumpled SUV, the crowd whispered, some shaking their heads, others openly smirking. Phones kept recording, ensuring the sisters' humiliation would spread far beyond the street. Their reign of intimidation had ended not with victory, but with a wreck, immortalized in pixels and gossip. Daniel remained by the gate, watching with a quiet satisfaction. He didn't gloat, didn't taunt, didn't raise his voice. His calm presence was victory enough. The sisters had wanted dominance, but they'd achieved nothing but disgrace. Their prized SUV was gone, their reputation shattered, and the very community they once manipulated now saw them for what they truly were. When the deputies finally loaded the sisters into the back of a cruiser, Nancy turned one last time, her glare venomous, her words a hiss through the open window. This isn't over. Daniel tipped his hat, his voice calm but edged with steel. It's over for today. The rest, that's up to karma. The cruiser door slammed, silencing her, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving only the wrecked SUV and a trail of dust in its wake. The neighbors slowly dispersed, murmuring their disbelief, some offering Daniel quiet nods of respect as they passed. The gate remained, strong and immovable, a silent monument to patience, resolve, and justice served. Daniel lingered a moment longer, hand resting on the steel-hidden wood, eyes following the fading sirens. The land was quiet again, but it was a new kind of quiet, one heavy not with dread, but with relief. His farm had held, his will had stood firm, and the storm had broken exactly as he knew it would. As he turned toward the porch, the evening breeze carried the scent of hay and dust, familiar and grounding. He allowed himself the smallest of smiles, a wry curve of the lips. The battle was done, but life on the farm went on. Tomorrow would bring chores, cattle, repairs, and another sunrise. And somewhere beyond the horizon, two sisters would be waking up to the weight of consequences they had written with their own hands.